As a teenager in the Finnish league, Patrik Laine was an absolutely electric talent. He was huge, he could move, and most importantly, he could shoot the puck. After being unanimously considered to be one of the best prospects in the 2016 NHL entry draft, Laine was eventually selected second overall by the Winnipeg Jets, only behind Auston Matthews. And the early returns on that selection were very good. In his 18-year-old rookie season, Laine scored 36 goals and 64 points in 73 games, showing his potential as one of the league's most lethal goal scorers. His 2017-2018 campaign was even more impressive, tallying 44 goals in 82 games and leading the Jets to the third round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. The future at this point for both Laine and the Winnipeg Jets seemed incredibly bright. The 2018-2019 season seemed destined to be a continuation of Laine's first 2 years in the league, but it ended up being arguably the strangest season any player has had in NHL history. Today, we're going to talk about why this season was so weird and use a bunch of historical comparables to show that it truly was unprecedented. To understand why this season was so weird, we will have to go back to the very start of it, October of 2018. The Winnipeg Jets entered the season with the third best betting odds to win the Stanley Cup. This does make sense, considering that they were coming off of a conference finals appearance and that Patrik Laine had completely exploded offensively in the last 2 years and was entering his 20-year-old season. However, Laine had a bit of a slow start to the 2018-2019 season, only scoring 3 goals and 2 assists in 12 games during the month of October. If we take these 3 goals that Laine scored and divide it by the 12 games Laine played, that'll give us his goal per game pace, equal to 0.25. Then, if we multiply that number by 82, the number of games in a full NHL season, that'll give us the amount of goals that he would score over a full season if he were to continue at that pace. 0.25 times 82 is 20.5, so at this point, Laine was on pace to score around 20 goals, far less than what he had achieved in the 2 previous seasons. However, a good NHL player having a slow October is hardly abnormal. Guys are still getting used to the grind after having several months off, and many often wake up in November. And Patrik Laine certainly woke up in November of 2018. We're going to go game by game in the month of November and show how Laine's 82-game goal pace changed as the month went on. Once again, to obtain the 82-game pace, all we have to do is take the total number of goals divided by the total number of games played, then multiply this number by 82. Let's get started with November 1st. The Winnipeg Jets traveled to Laine's homeland of Finland to take on the Florida Panthers in a pair of games as part of the NHL's Global Series. Winnipeg and Florida were selected because they had 2 iconic Finnish players, Patrik Laine of Winnipeg and Alexander Barkov of Florida. In this game, Laine scored 3 goals, often known as a hat trick. This game single-handedly changed his goal pace from 20 goals to 37 goals. On November the 2nd, the Jets played the Panthers again in the second and final game in Finland. Laine scored 1 goal, bumping his pace up from 37 goals to 41 goals. The Jets didn't play for another week, due to the travel required to visit and return from Finland. However, when they did return to North America, Laine continued to score. November the 9th, Laine scored 1 goal against the Colorado Avalanche, and now his pace went from 41 goals over the full season to 43. Laine's next week was a bit quiet, though. On November 11th, he scored 0 goals against New Jersey, and his pace went down to 41 goals. On November the 14th, he scored 0 goals against Washington, bumping his pace down to 38 goals. On November the 16th, he scored 0 goals against the Buffalo Sabres. At this point, Laine was on pace for 36 goals, the exact amount that he got in his rookie season. Little did anyone know that he was about to have one of the hottest stretches of any player in NHL history. November the 19th, Laine went to Vancouver and recorded a hat trick against the Vancouver Canucks, increasing his pace from 36 goals to 47. November the 21st, Laine continued his Western Canadian tour of dominance and scored 2 more goals against the Calgary Flames, putting him on pace to score around 53 goals. November the 23rd, Laine scored 1 goal in a 4-2 loss against the Minnesota Wild, only bumping his pace from 53 to 54. On the next day, November the 24th, the Jets had a game in St. Louis against the Blues. This would have been a perfectly excusable time for Laine to have an unproductive game. The second half of a back-to-back, a 2-hour flight from Minnesota to Missouri, surely he cooled off a bit, right? No, he scored 5 goals. 5! He recorded the first 5-goal game in the entire NHL since February of 2011 when Johan Franzen did it against the Ottawa Senators. That was more than 7.5 years prior. Predictably, this made Laine's goal pace rocket up, going from a 54-goal pace all the way up to a stunning 70-goal pace. Anyone who grew up in Canada watching hockey knows about the Safeway Score and Win contest, where a lucky fan can win $1 million if a player of the local team records 5 goals in a game. In my entire life watching hockey, I never saw any fan actually win this contest until a Winnipeg pastor named Christopher Haley won $1 million following this game. Anyways, the month of November isn't done yet. November the 27th, Laine scored 0 goals against the Pittsburgh Penguins. This game changed his pace to 67 goals. And, to close out the month, November the 29th, in the last Winnipeg Jets game of November, Laine scored 2 goals against the Chicago Blackhawks. When November was completely finished, Laine had officially recorded 18 goals in 12 games, so 1.5 goals per game. He was on pace for 71 goals in an 82-game season. Because November is the first full month of the NHL season, his pace changed dramatically due to the small sample size of games, and this graph shows how his goal pace changed as the month of November continued. If he maintained this 71-goal pace, he would be tied for the 10th most goals in a single season in NHL history. But how many goals did he end up with? 30, not even half of the 71-goal pace. And it wasn't due to injury. He played all 82 games that the Jets participated in. That means that he recorded 18 goals in 12 games in November and 12 goals in the other 70 games of the season. That is insane. He recorded 60% of his goals in a single month, despite playing every single game. I looked at the entire history of NHL players who had played at least 80 games and scored exactly 30 goals, to see if there was anyone who had this high of a percentage of their goals in 1 month. I found a total of 95 players, and the next closest player was Kirk Muller, who scored 13 goals, approximately 43% of his total goals, in December of 1989, but he played 16 games, 4 more than what Laine played in November of 2018. Outside of Muller and Laine, there have been a total of 6 other 30-goal scorers who had 10 or more of their goals in a single month. Steve Payne in November of 1982, who did it in 14 games, Patrice Bergeron in March of 2014, who did it in 17 games, Cale Makar in March of 1981, who did it in 15 games, Sergei Makarov in March of 1994, who did it in 13 games, Shane Doan in March of 2006, who did it in 14 games, and Alex Galchenyuk in March of 2016, which took 15 games. All of these players played more games, some many more games, than Laine did in November of 2018. Several of these seasons occurred in years with Olympic breaks where teams had to condense their schedule to put more games in the other months. Another metric that we could use to show the weirdness of Laine's season is the variance. The whole idea of the variance is that we could take 30, the total number of goals scored by Laine, then divide it by 7, the total number of months that Laine played that year, to get the average number of goals Laine scored per month. This value is approximately 4.29. Then, we could take the number of goals Laine scored each month and take the squared difference between the number of goals he scored in each month and the average goals per month that he scored. Then, we could add up these differences and divide it by the total number of months played, 7, to find the variance. The whole idea here is that if this is a high number, this means that Laine's monthly goal totals were really inconsistent and often far away from his average goals per month of 4.29. In the case of Laine, his variance was 33.06, but that number in and of itself doesn't mean anything. We need to compare it to all the other seasons we looked at. Of the 95 seasons that we looked at earlier, Laine's variance was easily the highest, and the next closest was only 17.06. In fact, the second highest variance was closer to the 93rd highest variance than it was to Laine's variance. In case you're curious about who had the lowest variance, it was Chris Gratton in the 1996-1997 season, who scored exactly 4 or 5 goals in every month, far different than what Laine did. Obviously, Laine's 18 goals in 1 month was extremely impressive, but it's not completely unheard of. Similar feats have been accomplished before. In fact, in the 110-year history of the National Hockey League, there have been 18 recorded instances of a player scoring 18 or more goals in a single month. If we look at the goals per game rate obtained by taking the number of goals and dividing it by the total number of games played for each of these 18 players, Laine's November is the 4th best of the bunch, only behind Nusi Lalonde and 2 different months from Joe Malone. All of the seasons better than Laine's happened over 100 years ago, and if you look at any stat lines from the early NHL seasons, they are just weird and inexplicable. You can genuinely make the argument that Laine's November was the greatest month of goal scoring in modern NHL history. However, the interesting part is when you look at how all of these players finished their seasons. What I did here was I took each player's total number of goals across the whole season and divided it by the total number of games they played. then multiplied it by 82 to adjust for the 82-game pace that players currently play. We are adjusting for an 82-game pace here because the total number of games in an NHL season has differed slightly throughout its history, but in the last 40 years it's been much more consistent, so many of these pace numbers are going to basically be the same as the real number that these players finished with. Of these 18 players, Laine's 30 goals were by far the lowest total. The next lowest total was 63 goals, more than double what Laine finished with in 2019. Every other player to score 18 or more goals in a month finished their season with unequivocally elite numbers, and Laine finished with just 30. As of 2026, Laine hasn't returned to reach the 30-goal mark. He's often surpassed 20 goals, but he will likely never return to the level he was at in 2018. Nonetheless, Patrik Laine will go down in the record books for having one of the most unusual seasons and drop-offs in NHL history. I would feel bad for the people of Winnipeg, but I feel as if they deserve it, after they subjected our entire country to this abomination of a children's program.